Welcome to Public Health on Call, a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where we bring evidence, experience, and perspective to make sense of today's leading health challenges. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes.
It's Lindsay Smith-Rogers. Today, the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices. That's the committee at the Centers of Disease Control and Prevention in the news lately. Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. fired all the members, and the new committee voted quickly to take a vaccine formulation off the market. Dr. Grace Lee is a pediatric infectious disease specialist who served on the committee from 2016 to 2023, including serving as chair during the pandemic. She joins Dr. Josh Sharfstein to talk about what's changed with the committee and the potential implications for public health. Let's listen.
Dr. Grace Lee, it's great to see you. Thank you for joining me on Public Health on Call.
Thanks so much for having me, Josh.
So I wonder if I might ask you to start by introducing yourself to our audience. I know that you are a pediatrician and an infectious disease physician, but tell me a little bit more about your career.
I am trained as a pediatric infectious diseases physician. I actually worked in many years in a variety of vaccine safety surveillance systems in the past, particularly with CDC and FDA. I had the unique opportunity to help support some of the efforts we did around both H1N1 vaccine safety surveillance as well as COVID vaccine safety surveillance over the past decade. And I've had the privilege of serving on the U.S. Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices from 2016 to 2023.
That is a lot of work about vaccines, focused on vaccine safety. Why pick that topic to work on?
Well, vaccine safety surveillance is a critical component of any public health system, and particularly one where we are ensuring the delivery of vaccines to ensure the safety of both individuals and populations. Prior to vaccine approvals by the FDA, those undergo clinical trials, phase 1, 2, and 3 clinical trials, and some of them quite large. As you know, during the pandemic, trial sizes 40 to 60,000 patients in randomized controlled trials. And I can recall back to a time when we were studying rotavirus vaccine and clinical trials, up to 70 to 90,000 patients enrolled in those trials. But as part of any vaccine life cycle, it is critical to continue to not only evaluate the efficacy and safety of vaccines prior to licensure, but also to ensure robust post-market safety surveillance as well as post-market effectiveness surveillance.
And one way to think about it is those results might affect who gets vaccinated, how the recommendations are structured, as well as information about the risks and benefits for parents.
Absolutely. All of that information, because we do that in a real-time way, and it's not a one look and you're done, because that's an ongoing activity that we usually do on behalf of our colleagues in the public health system, such as CDC and our local and state public health colleagues. It's really important to ensure that the recommendations are sound, that we continue to weigh the evidence in real time, and that we're ensuring that our recommendations don't need to be altered over time.
So let's talk about the committee. You mentioned you have served on the Advisory Committee for Immunization Practices. This is a committee that has been in the news lately, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. But I'd like to ask you to tell me a little bit about this committee and what it was like to be on it.
As you know, the U.S. Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices has been around since 1964. It is unique in that it's a federal advisory committee that advises the director of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention on how to use vaccines in the U.S. population. And that is distinct and different from what FDA does, which is to license or approve or authorize vaccines for use in the U.S. population. So ACIP has fundamentally helped to support a harmonized childhood and adult immunization schedule that has been critical for preventing the spread of infections such as measles, flu, whooping cough, polio, and how to prevent serious complications from infections.
Dr. Lee, I wonder if you could tell me how you wound up getting selected for this advisory committee. What was that process like?
I applied to serve on the committee, and it took nearly 2 years before I was actually seated on the committee.
And what was happening in those 2 years?
There was a robust review process of all applicants based on both the expertise of the applicants as well as what was needed at the time for the committee in terms of the expertise to complement the other members.
So you may have been selected, for example, for your expertise in vaccine safety science, like we were talking about before.
Yes, I think that was one aspect, and also having familiarity with cost-effectiveness analysis.
Got it. Now, you get on the committee.
This was now back in 2016, and at the time, we were actually provided an orientation in person to understand what the committee's role and functions were, as well as getting an understanding that I did not have the opportunity to really learn about until I sat on the committee to understand the work group process. That ACIP work group process was pretty fundamental to a lot of the work that we did for the committee.
Can you tell me a little bit more about that? What do you mean by work groups?
Sure. Well, the work groups are specifically, essentially, subcommittees that include specific expertise to address a particular policy question related to a vaccine. So at that time, when a new vaccine was coming up for potential review and approval by the FDA, we would develop what's called a terms of reference for that committee, or a mini charter for that committee, to understand what our scope was, what the policy question was, what the potential interventions might be, and what outcomes of importance there were. So PICO questions. And there was careful vetting and selection of the ACIP working group members to ensure that they had the necessary expertise to inform that decision-making, depending on what that policy question was.
And were you in general impressed by the people who served with you on that committee and the people who were on work groups?
Yes. I mean, the work group leads and the CDC, the work group leads, which were typically an ACIP member in partnership with CDC subject matter expert, would co-lead those working groups. And those working group members were very much the experts in their field about a particular vaccine.
And how did this committee go about its work?
Our goal was to understand and to carefully review all of the data that were coming in great detail, to help ensure that we could support options for recommendations for the full committee, the full ACIP committee, to consider, as well as to ensure that we had done due diligence and in the review of the evidence that was needed to help make a recommendation. I can say that depending, and I've actually chaired a few of those work groups in the past.
And would you say that there pretty much everyone agreed when you would go into a work group, or were there a lot of different opinions that were, hashed out, and how did you work through those?
I mean, the purpose of the work group was to have many of the discussions that were needed to ensure, number one, that we had all of the data and the evidence that was necessary for the review, and to ensure that the decision-making process was sound. But second, diverse opinions were important to include and to make sure that we understood the potential outcomes of any particular recommendation. And so, I can recall some really challenging recommendations where we had work group members really have a diverse range of opinions about what potential recommendation options could be. And for those particular recommendations, you would see the full range come to committee for consideration.
Mm-hmm. Could you give me an example?
I'm thinking about pneumococcal vaccines, for example. I can recall when we were reconsidering the adult pneumococcal vaccine recommendations, that it ranged from, should this be a universal recommendation? Should this be shared clinical decision-making? What age should we consider as thresholds or cutoffs? I mean, all of those things were really important. And all of that discussion was based on what data and evidence we had to review.
It's a very good example. So this committee's been in the news. The Secretary of Health and Human Services fired all of the members and himself appointed a new group of members. What was your first reaction when you saw that?
We have never seen that happen in the history of ACIP. Typically, committee members have terms, and those terms, when they expire, is typically when new committee members would get appointed. I have never seen an entire committee be dismissed via the news. It was actually announced, I think, in the Wall Street Journal before the members were even aware of it.
And then the appointments that were made didn't appear to go through the kind of process that you went through.
Well, in the past, knowing that it took upwards of 2 years to appoint a new committee member, and that was, at that point, 3 or 4 committee members at a time might rotate off for their term, it was surprising that within 2 days, an entire committee was appointed.
The other thing that has been a bit unusual is the way that the committee meetings have run.
I think what surprised me most, and there always are urgent or emergent issues that arise, in which case I can see why there needs to be accommodation of a particular agenda. However, what was unusual about this is the typical process would have been to assemble a work group with terms of reference and clear purpose, assemble work group members to then review evidence in advance of a committee meeting, and then be able to deliberate on what the considerations might be.
And that's not exactly what you saw for some of the things coming to a vote.
It was not clear to me that a work group was assembled for some of the new discussions that were brought forward in that meeting.
So at this meeting, this first meeting of the new committee, it voted to take a particular vaccine off the market, and it had an external speaker come in and talk about the safety issues involved in that vaccine, but they didn't let the staff at the CDC talk about their own analysis or their own opinions about the safety of the vaccine. Would you say that that is unusual for how this particular committee would traditionally have operated?
Well, typically, first, there would have been a working group assembled, and it was not clear there was one. Second, I think there was not really a clear policy question other than to potentially remove a particular product. Third, I would say a robust discussion would be had around what the issues would be and the benefits and risks of a particular intervention, in this case, the removal of a particular vaccine product. And then finally, what I would say is it is unusual to base a recommendation on a single presentation from an external advisor.
It's clear that the processes this committee has used and the people who are involved have changed dramatically. And I wonder, as you look back on your experience, what are you worried might be getting lost?
Number one, I would say I'm really worried about transparency in terms of being able to see all of the data. And then I think the second thing would be the consistency of the decision-making process. So we worked really hard to ensure that we had a robust process in place, the evidence to recommendations process, to ensure we considered all of the domains that might impact a decision. And by not following that process, I think I worry that there will be inconsistencies in how decisions are made, and that may have long-lasting impacts for the health of our communities.
Given the tremendous implications of the recommendations of this committee, are you worried about the quality of recommendations that could come out from a very different process?
Absolutely. I think that will continue to be a concern without a robust process in place and without being able to follow that process in a transparent manner. Decisions could depend on the opinions of individuals as opposed to a robust consideration by the full committee about the entire implications of any particular recommendation.
And there's a lot at stake.
There's a lot at stake. This committee matters because it serves the American public in providing scientific and evidence-based recommendations for vaccine use in the U.S. Not only that, but it's tied to the ability to actually have access to vaccines. And without that link, and without being able to ensure access to vaccines, individuals who want to get protected may not be able to in the future.
Dr. Grace Lee, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Josh.
Public Health on Call is a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, produced by Joshua Sharfstein, Lindsay Smith-Rogers, and Stephanie Desmond. Audio production by J.B. Arbogast, Michael Bonfils, Spencer Greer, Matthew Martin, and Philip Porter, with support from Chip Hickey. Distribution by Nick Moran. Production coordination by Catherine Ricardo. Analytics by Elisa Rosen. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes. Thank you for listening.